Welcome to Sociology. We're doing the last segment and the second part of social class and social stratification in Canada. So let's begin with, basically, we're going to carry on where we left off. We're going to look at what is poverty in Canada and what are some of the demographic features about who is poor in Canada and what are some of the effects of poverty. And then we'll touch on the theories, the sociological theories of social inequity in Canada. All right, so let's get started with contemporary sociological models of social class and social structure. And we're going to sort of break this down a little bit. And there's a little bit of there is a little of an under-discussed area in Canada. And this is this whole area of social class. And as we like to think, everyone does well, and so we generally will say that we are happy middle-class people. However, statistically, there's a distinction of class structure in Canada. And we'll look at we're going to look at two models. One is based on Weberian an approach, and the other is based on Marxian approach. And we'll begin with the Weberian model. And here, one class position is based on three elements. So our class status is based on three elements: education, occupation of the family's head, whether that be mother or father, and the family income. Those are the three elements in the Weberian. And they use these criteria. The class structure in Canada is divided into 6 classes. There's the upper class, the upper middle class, then there's the middle class, and this gets a little fuzzy because we also have the working class, and then we have the working poor, and then we have the underclass. And we're going to look at each one of these a little bit individually, and we'll start to understand how they differentiate them according to how the Weberians describe each of these structures in social class. And we'll look at each one. So let's begin with the upper class. The upper class, that's the wealthiest and the most powerful class. They own substantial income-producing assets. About 3% of Canadians would fit into this group. A small number of these individuals, about 1,000, are the upper class, and they yield enormous amounts of power. Now their income is based on ownership, whether that's property, companies. It's very high income groups. Now the upper middle class, this is highly educated professionals, or they divert their income from family-owned businesses. Now this is a well-off group. They have a combination of university education, authority, and independence on a job, and high-income quality people of this class. So they have good income, they have good education. This class is what's most influenced by education. Then there's the middle class. Now traditionally, most middle class positions have been relatively secure and enabling advancement. Today, well, we have about 4 factors which have diminished the chances of material success for members of the middle class. Now, if we were looking at these 4, we have escalating housing costs, and you've been hearing about this in the news lately, in particular in Toronto and Vancouver. Occupational insecurity. This has a lot to do with part-time work, seasonal work. Some of the reasons for the strike were to do with occupational insecurity. And then blocked upward mobility is the third, and cost of living squeezes. Now, that doesn't mean you can't move up, but these are barriers to making it a very effective move up. Then we can look at the working class. Well, about 30% of the Canadian population is in the working class. The core of this class is made up of semi-skilled machine operators as well as some workers in the service sector. Now, the working class is made up of probably the number one employment, which is truck driving. Working class, the core of this class is made up of semi-skilled machine workers, truck drivers. The working class families can earn less than middle class families and have less financial security. Now, the working poor account for about 20% of the Canadian population. They live just above the poverty level, and we'll get into a little later what that poverty level is. They're unskilled workers, seasonal jobs, low-paying factory jobs, service jobs. Now, groups who are overrepresented in this class, and there's a few of them that are typically, there's more people of these demographics falling within this lower area. Employed single mothers and their children, members of some visible minority groups, Indigenous people, recent immigrants are all overrepresented among the working poor. And then the last group is that which is known as the underclass. They're very poor, they're seldom employed, they're caught in long-term deprivation that results from low levels of education and income and high rates, low levels of education, low levels of income, and high rates of unemployment. Some are unable to work because of racial or ethnic discrimination, or age, or disability. Single mothers are overrepresented in this group. So let's touch now on the Marxian model, and we're going to be using a theorist by the name of Eric Olin Wright, and he's the leading theorist following the Marxian approach. Now, there are 4 criteria for placement in class structure from Eric Olin Wright's perspective. Ownership of the means of production, or the capitalist class. So they own where we work. They hire, they don't work for others. 2 would be purchase of labor of others. Then this would be the managerial class. People who in our world would be the people who do the hiring. We would apply to them for jobs. They're the managerial class. Control of labor of others, well, this is the small business class. And then lastly, it's the sale of one's own labor, and that's the working class. So there's 4 groups, and we're going to look at each one and see the differentiation of them. You'll see them in the graphic beside me here. The capitalist class, now according to Wright, the capitalist class holds most of the wealth and power in society through ownership of capital. You'll find the top 10 people in Canada with the top incomes fitting within this group. Their source of income is profit, interest, very high salaries. They make major decisions about workplaces, whether or not, when Target or when Zellers closed, that high upper class, the capitalist class, that made decisions about what stores were going to open, what stores were going to close, and it has a huge impact on the working group. Now, the managerial class, the people in the managerial class do not own the capital, but they have substantial control over the means of production. They are upper-level managers, supervisors, and professionals. They may be influenced by, they may influence the organization of work and the treatment of workers. So they would be policymakers that could influence the work and treatment of workers. The small business class, well, this class consists of small business owners, craftspeople who may hire a few employees but are largely doing their own work. Now, this is the group that was really upset with the increase in the minimum wage because they felt that it was going to affect them hardest. Some of these professionals now share attributes with members of the capitalist class. It's in this small business class that we find many people's hopes of achieving upward mobility. In today's world, what you'll hear the term to be would be entrepreneurship, and that falls within this group of small business. The working class, well, the working class is made up of a number of subgroups. But we're only going to touch base briefly just to sort of identify. There's blue-collar workers and white-collar workers. And there are certainly other subgroups. But when we're looking at the working class, about half of all employees fit within the working class. You'll find more information about blue-collar workers and white-collar workers in your textbook, so I would take a moment to look at that. Now, consequences of inequity. When there is inequity, there are consequences to this, and let's look. Now, income and wealth are intrinsically related to an individual's life chances. If you remember, life chances are good food, good places to live, and education. And that if you have those things, you have opportunity to move horizontally or vertically in your mobility. Persons with a high income and substantial wealth have more control over their lives, and it only makes sense. Persons with less income, especially those living in poverty, must spend their limited resources on the basic necessities of life. So let's look at some of the consequences, and we'll categorize them. Physical, mental health, and nutrition as being one of the consequences. People who are healthy and well educated and who have high-paying jobs are much more likely to be healthy than poor people. If you're healthy and you're wealthy, if you're wealthy, you're healthy. And that's you'll see in a minute, I'll show you a graphic where this really brings it clear. People who are poor have shorter life expectancies, are at greater risk for chronic illnesses such as diabetes and heart disease, cancer, as well as for infectious diseases such as tuberculosis. Children born into poor families are much greater risk of dying during their first year of life. Now, we may not witness this as much in Canada as they do in other parts of the world, but clearly lower income people, no matter where they are, run greater risks for health issues. Most of the poor do not receive preventative medical and dental checkups. They can't afford it, but we'll also see where they're not in close proximity to these sorts of services. Hunger is related to class position in income inequity. Now, the two images I'm going to show you here, the first is an investigative report looking at access, the access that the rich and the poor have to doctors, nutritional food that's fresh nutritional food, and health and recreational facilities in relationship to where they live. And the report notes that the rich are proximity-wise, very close to good food, good health care, and recreational activities. The poor are much further away in their communities from doctors, fresh food and vegetables, and recreational activities. So it even shows by virtue of where you live, you have greater opportunities for health and wealth. Whereas where you live when you're poor, those services aren't in your neighborhood, let alone around the corner or around the block. The second image here is a report on where poor live and where the pollution-producing industries are located. And in Toronto, they appear to be in the same areas. So your likelihood for health is made more difficult because where you live, there are pollution-producing industries in your neighborhood, and they are not in the neighborhoods of the rich. So let's look at a second issue, and that is that of education. A consequence of inequity is education. Educational opportunities and the life chances are directly linked. Functionalist theorists view education as the elevator to social mobility. With education, you have the opportunity to raise yourself up. Conflict theory theorists stress that schools are agencies for reproducing the capitalist class system and perpetuating inequity in society. And then lastly, we'll touch on, in terms of consequences, crime and the lack of security or safety. Although people from all classes commit crimes, they commit different types of crimes. Capitalism produces social inequities that contribute to criminality among people. Poverty and violence are also linked. It's not surprising, given the kinds of things that you would expect people would need who live in poverty, and can't get through appropriate other management or ways, just like when we talked about in crime and deviancy. Okay, now let's look at poverty in Canada. Now some of this will give you some perspective about how it's defined in Canada and how maybe it's misunderstood. The official poverty line, based on what is considered to be the minimum amount of money required for living in a subsistence level. That's often what we would consider to be the poverty line. In Canada, has no official definition of poverty. There's no official way of measuring poverty, and there's no official poverty line. And that's an important note. It's not like poverty should be elusive. However, it appears, at least in Canada, we don't have a poverty line. Now, our most accepted definition of poverty is Statistics Canada's before-tax low-income cutoff. The low-income level at which a family may be in strained circumstances because it spends considerably more money on basic necessities of life, food, shelter, and clothing, than the average family. Now this varies from family size and community size. According to the LICO measure, any individual or family that spends more than 70% of its income on necessities, food, shelter, and clothing, is considered to be living in poverty. Now when you think about that, 70%, so you make $1,000 every 2 weeks, say. $700 goes for your rent, clothing, and your food. The rest pays for what? So after calculating the cost of food, shelter, and clothing, there's only a fraction left for personal care, household needs, furniture, telephone, transportation, school supplies, health care. There's no money for entertainment, recreation, reading material, insurance, or donations. If you think that that's the limit, well, how do you live under those circumstances comfortably? How do you provide for your children? When sociologists define poverty, they distinguish between two types of poverty: absolute poverty and relative poverty. When we look at absolute poverty, this is a level of economic deprivation in which people do not have the means to secure the basic necessities of life. They don't have food, shelter, or clothing, that ability to pay for. The relative poverty, that's a level of economic deprivation in which people may be able to afford basic necessities, but still are unable to maintain an average standard of living. And so when we look at poverty in Canada, we struggle with, what is it? We don't have a clear definition of what it is. We have statistical definitions based on income of what it could be, but we don't have a great definition for it. So who are the poor? Well, poverty in Canada is not randomly distributed, but it's highly concentrated among certain groups of people. Most notably, it's focused on women, children, the persons with disabilities, and Indigenous people. Those are the groups that are most notably affected by poverty in Canada. Now we're going to look at different criteria, and we're going to start with the criteria of age. What influence does age have on poverty? The poverty rate for children under the age of 18 is approximately 17%. Now when we talk about under the age of 18, not all of those children live with parents. Some of them are homeless. And so this poverty rate is very high, 17%. More than 1.3 million Canadian children are living in poverty. And a large number of children, however, just above the official poverty line, or the low income cutoff. So what's important about that is to remember, when we talk about how, well, Canada doesn't like to talk about class because we don't like to acknowledge the degree of poverty that exists in such a wealthy country as Canada. Now let's look at gender. About 2/3 of all adults living in poverty in Canada are women. Women in all categories are in greater risk of poverty than men are. The risk is particularly significant for single-parented families headed by women. All women are not equally susceptible to poverty. Many visible minority women may experience what's called reshuffled poverty, a condition of deprivation that follows them regardless of the type of family in which they live, or also what's known as multiple jeopardies. It refers to the even greater risk of poverty experienced by women who are immigrants, members of visible minorities, indigenous, or who have disability. Thirdly, we'll look at race. A disproportionate percentage of impoverished in Canada are Indigenous persons and recent immigrants. Indigenous people are among the most severely disadvantaged. About 1/3 live in poverty. Now remember, poverty we're looking at is basically the low income cutoff. The median income of Indigenous persons is just over $29,000 a year, as compared to the national average income of $75,000 per year. And we look at disability. Many persons with disability continue to be excluded from the workplace, not because of their disability itself, but because of the environmental barriers for the disability, or in the workplace. That is to say, the doors don't open automatically, the alleyways or the laneways for walking are too narrow for a wheelchair. Adults with disability have significantly lower incomes than Canadians without disability. The self-reported median total of working age persons with disabilities was slightly more than $20,000 a year. So I want to touch just briefly now on two structures, economic and structural forces of poverty. And these are just two larger macro issues that affect poverty. Poverty has both economic and structural sources. The economic is about 1/3 of low-income families have one parent working full-time. The minimum wage full-time jobs do not allow a worker to keep a family of 4 above the official poverty line. So economically, it's difficult because the minimum wage doesn't allow for people to be successful. Structurally, changing our societies from industrial-based ones to information-based ones. And this has made it difficult, in particular what's known as automation. Closures of factories, the deindustrialization of North America because of the ability to automate, for example, car factories. That's done by machines largely now. The deindustrialization, corporations have been divesting in Canada and millions have lost their jobs. In the 2005 period of time, some 500,000 men and women lost jobs in the manufacturing industry in Ontario alone. That had a huge impact on people's lives. Emergence of what is termed job de-skilling, a reduction in the proficiency needed to perform a specific job that leads to corresponding reduction in the wages for that job. Shifts from manufacturing to service occupations has resulted in loss of higher paying positions and the replacement with lower paying and less secure positions. People going from industry going back to school as second careers to re-educate into something that they can afford to do and make a living at. So now we're going to look at the theorists. The functionalists we're going to start with and we'll carry through. Functionalists, social inequality is not only inevitable but necessary for the smooth functioning of society. It's the only theory that includes as a part of their theory a term known as dysfunctionalism, and that for society to successfully continue to move, dysfunction gets accepted. So in this instance, poverty is being a part of the overall experience that gives other people work to help them, which helps grow and develop society. The Davis-Moore thesis is the definitive functional explanation for social inequity. All societies have important tasks that must be accomplished. Some positions are more important than others. The most important positions must be filled by the most qualified people. Now, this is the functionalist perspective. The positions that require talent that is scarce must be the most highly rewarded. Those most highly rewarded should be functionally unique and on which people in other positions rely for expertise, direction, or financing. Now, Davis-Moore thesis assumes that social stratification results in what's known as mediocrity, a hierarchy in which all positions are rewarded based on people's ability and credentials. So this is important about functionalism, is that structure and function. People are part of the structure. Who does what is the structure that provides a function for society. And so if we have, and I think you'll find in your textbook the example used as doctors. They're considered high professionals, highly needed. Therefore, we should be putting in the most educated, the best doctors into those positions to make the kinds of decisions that are important in the healthcare field. Now, this thesis is critiqued by on several levels, including that it ignores inequities based on inherent wealth and intergenerational family status, the rich who pass their wealth onto their children. Conflict theory. From the conflict perspective, people with economic and political power are able to shape and distribute the rewards, the resources, the privilege, and the opportunities in society for their own benefit. Core values in Canada emphasize the importance of material possessions, hard work, individual initiative to get ahead, and behavior that supports the existing social structures. Conflict theorists also note that the laws and informal social norms support inequity in Canada. Culture supports a capitalist social structure. Now, the feminist approach, according to the feminist scholars, that the quality of an individual's life experience is a reflection of both class position and gender. Remember, with feminists, whatever the issues are globally, gender becomes a secondary or, in fact, primary condition. Social inequities within social class, gender is added to class to result in a double ghetto and what's known as the second shift. Now, the evidence for this, well, many women work in low-paying positions and their income, on average, is less than that of men's. Women, more than men, will come home after doing their job and do what's known as the double shift or the second shift. Women are more likely than men to engage in family care, which is not remunerated. There's no pay for making lunches, making dinner, cleaning the house, doing the laundry. Women become mothers. When women become mothers, they often lose accumulated wealth and experience. Within any class, women are less advantaged than men. The cause of the inequity lie in the organization of capitalism itself. Now we'll touch base on symbolic interactionalists. Well, they usually do not analyze larger structure factors. They're the only one that's micro that contribute to inequity and poverty. A few studies do provide a rare insight into the social interactions between people from vastly different class locations. Studies by Domhoff that wealthy businessmen are bound together by games, rituals, and sharing of meals and other activities. It's those sorts of things that create a bond between some of these richer people. You don't find a lot of very wealthy and rich and prosperous men and women interacting with lower income people unless it's in a philanthropic sort of a manner. But they do get together in groups of their own class, if you will, and engage in dinners and celebrations which bond them together. Another example of the micro perspective, the face-to-face interactions and displays, is what's known as differential behavior. Differential behavior between non-equals confirms the inequity of this relationship. Research has found that the wealthy often demand deference from the lower class. Now, deference would be like a bow or eyes turned down when someone of a higher status approaches. So that's deference. And you can see from the graphics that I've posted there are examples that we see difference in everyday life. The lower income, the person who was on the side of the street begging for money isn't at a higher level than you. They usually are on the ground looking up at you. That's a deference position. Okay. Wow. We sailed through. We're done. Congratulations. Be prepared for the tests in the new year. And I hope you have a great break. Bye for now.